Hey, what's up guys, I'm Billy with SpecTrain. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to answer your questions about this little mount right here. This is probably one of the number one things I get questions on these days very, very regularly, and we're going to answer these questions. If you're not familiar, the reason this mount is unique primarily is it's simply taller, right? It lifts my optic above the rifle to sit higher than a normal optic will, and we're going to talk through some of the pros and cons of tall mounts in general, as well as the features and the reason that I like these mounts specifically. Let me start off real quickly with one of the most common questions that I get, okay, which is it faster? Okay, for those that don't know, this is called the Unity Fast Mount. That's kind of what they've marketed it as. It's the name that Unity Tactical calls these mounts. So people think that because the optic is sitting higher above the rifle, that it will get in front of my face sooner, and therefore I'll be able to shoot sooner. I would present to you that's not the case at all. The reason I like these mounts has nothing to do with how fast they are, okay? Let me explain. So what this mount really does, the height of your mount really does, is it influences the relationship between, right, where the rifle sits in my shoulder and then where my face has to be to get behind the optic. One of the reasons I specifically like tall mounts is it allows me to fully bury the rifle in my shoulder. If you're not familiar with why that matters, check out our rifle recoil videos. I'll link those below. But I get to totally bury the rifle in my shoulder, and then I don't have to lower my head at all. I simply lift the shoulder up to my face, lift the gun up to my face, and now I'm behind this optic and I'm ready to run it with my head upright. If I had to bury my head down onto the stock more and get a more traditional cheek weld on the rifle, what you'll notice is that my head has to be lowered now to the gun. I can't simply lift the gun to my face. And that works. There's pros and cons to it, right? But the cons revolve around mainly head and neck, basically neck fatigue over time. Having my head down like this, especially if you're wearing a helmet or any kind of gear on your head that increases weight, that can get really fatiguing over time. And then some of the other cons revolve around vision, right? If I have my head down like this, I'm no longer looking to the center of my eyeballs. It's removing some of my field of vision. It's just not optimal, right? Obviously, I would rather just simply face the target and be able to lift the rifle straight up to my head and look through the optic. That would be ideal. So that's one of the reasons that I like tall mounts. However, there's a lot of tall mounts out on the market, and a lot of them are a lot cheaper than Unity. So where did 226 come from? As an example, here is a 193 mount. This is just a riser from American Defense Manufacturing. It lifts this EOTech up to where it's 1.93 inches above the bore of the barrel, right? And this does very much the same thing as the Unity mounts. It lifts the rifle up to my face pretty nicely and makes it fairly comfortable to run behind this optic. So where did 226 come from? Well, it actually, in my opinion, is not about being fast. It's not really anything to do with the primary optic at all. It's more about magnifiers. Okay, so here we have a magnifier, and if you've ever ran magnifiers in the past, you're familiar with how you can flip the magnifier up behind your red dot, see through here, take advantage of magnification. Then if you need to switch back to working up close, traditionally what you would do is take this magnifier and flip it outboard, and it would sit out here to the side of your rifle. There's a couple of downsides to that, right? It can reduce your field of view out to the right side as you're running it. The other really irritating thing to me is that a lot of times you can bump things, or if I sling my rifle like so to where the magnifier would be sitting against my body, a lot of times the magnifier will pop back in place behind the optic, and now when I lift the rifle back up, my magnifier is there when I didn't want it to be. It's always annoying when your gear is changing its position or orientation without you doing that on purpose, right? So that's a real irritant factor. What we get with 226 is flip to center. So now I have the ability to be looking through the magnifier and simply flip this down out of the way, and I can look over the top of this through my main optic. And that magnifier is completely down, out of the way, not an irritant whatsoever. I'm just looking through my optic. I have full field of view. It's not blocking my vision at all. And it's really a superior way of running a magnifier, in my personal opinion. So magnifiers are a big advantage at specific 226 height. One of the other advantages, though, is with iron sights. If you feel compelled to run backup irons on your rifle, one of the issues when I have like a 193, this is obviously an EOTech, so it's got a massive optic body. It makes backup irons difficult on high mounts no matter what. But with all this body below here, when I get to 193 or above, my iron sights are kind of below the window. I can't see them through the glass anymore. So if I want to use centerline backup irons, I have to be able to rip the optic off the rifle. In other words, if I want to use those irons, which is kind of a pain. One of the things that Unity's done to get around this a little bit, so that we have this window below the optic, and what you can actually see is that there's built-in iron sights into the mount. There's a ghost ring rear and a normal post front sight, which I think you should be able to see on camera. Now, those are literally inside the optic. So my ghost ring's here, my front post is here. They are zeroable. You can see I have a couple knobs here on the side of the rifle that facilitate that, and there's also Allen keys that go through the bottom to adjust height and that kind of thing. Yeah, the iron sights do actually work. Now, the sight radius is extremely short. So here's the smallest pistol that I own. There's a 365. And you'll notice that the iron sight radius, even on a small pocket pistol like a 365, is more than double what you get out of this mount, right? So would the Unity built-in sights be something that I want to use for any kind of prolonged time, for precise work at distance, anything like that? Absolutely not, right? In a pinch, do they work? Do they give you rough point of aim? Yes, they do. It actually works. But the real advantage to me is not that. It's more of a saving space thing. So check this out. Let's say I've got a rifle with a magnifier set up like this. This is my optic in the preferred spot that I like it. I have to have a magnifier basically all the way to the rear because of eye relief issues. And now I want to throw a rear sight onto this gun. It gets really, really difficult because this sight, as an example, doesn't fit. And I've got the biggest gap between these two that you basically can fit. I've got my optic all the way forward, this all the way back, right? Could I slide this optic all the way back and maybe fit it in front? Yes, there's different things you can do to try to work around it. But one of the cool things you can do with this is just take out that front post, okay? Remove the front post, leave that rear sight in. Now I can mount a front sight on my rifle wherever I want and use the integrated rear that's built into the Unity mount along with whatever front sight I choose to mount onto my rifle. The other cool thing about that is if I want to make it a fixed sight, right? So not a flip-up sight that has some kind of, actuation like that. I want to actually use a smaller, more compact, more robust, stronger, all one-piece steel fixed front sight. It can sit there and I can't see it through my optic at all. It's not blocking my optic at all because it's completely below the optic field of view. So that's a cool side benefit if you care about having backup sights, in other words, around your primary optic, right? So let's talk about different optics. Obviously, this works really well with Aimpoint style optic that sit right on top of this mount. What Unity also does have, if you're running, a holographic or a different kind of mounting solution that has basically an optic that has a built-in mount to it, is they have these risers right here. So this works well with some of the SIG optics, as well as obviously, the Vortex AMGs or the EOTechs, these style optics have built-in mounts to it. Obviously, you can see this has a built-in mount base with a QD lever on the side. And all this is a riser, right? So this little kind of goldish piece at the bottom is the Unity riser, which lifts a standard optic up to the 226 height, right? So if I want now to run a magnifier behind this, I can use flip to center along with this mount. Negates the iron sight thing we were just talking about, but it still gives me that nice high natural shooting position along with flip center magnification. So if you have these kind of magnifiers and optics and you want to run those features, you can use a riser. They have these available for absolute height optics as well as lower third height optics, which are the two common obviously sizes that optics would come with. So let's talk about cons, right? One of the big cons people like to talk about is at sort of CQB distances, the holdovers, right? So in other words, obviously when I'm firing this weapon, if I'm at point blank, you're right, I got a target against the end of the barrel. My point of aim is going to be here, my barrel's down here, I'm going to be hitting a low up close. So you have to know your holds. As a shooter, when I have this gun zeroed out at 50 or 100 meters or whatever it is, I've got to know, hey, at 10 yards, here's where I have to aim roughly to hit my point of impact. And so the bigger that is, it's common sense that the bigger that is, the bigger my holdovers are going to be, slightly more complicated, slightly harder to hit precise targets up close. My counter to that is simply this. It's not as big of a deal as you think it is. So here is the Spectrane zero target, right? We use these in classes. The idea behind this is at 10 yards, if I have a rifle zeroed at 50 yards, if I put my dot right in the center of that black circle, I'm going to be hitting down by these three lines, depending on if I have a lower third, 193 or 226, my optic mount height, right? So you'll notice that the distance between the 226 and the lower third height there is less than an inch. It's a very small measurement, okay? So it's not that big of a deal. As a matter of fact, if I fold this in half, and I put, this dot on a, a more realistic size target, I bet very few of you, right, could probably tell me emphatically whether it would be better for you to hit there or there, right? You may have a preference, but if I asked you, hey, what exactly is that bullet gonna hit versus what exactly is that bullet gonna hit, you probably couldn't really tell me, right? Same thing even if I go for some kind of a, headshot, right? Those lines are really close together and it's not that big of a deal. Now, don't take that as me saying you shouldn't know your holds and you shouldn't be able to shoot precise targets up close, because you absolutely should. But where people get ticked off about high mounts is a lot of times I find when they're shooting simulated targets. So in other words, instead of shooting, practically sized targets at further distances, we're shooting really reduced sized targets way up close. It isn't exactly a practical exercise. Shooting a 1-inch circle at 5 yards with your rifle is not necessarily a practical exercise, right? It's nothing I specifically want my rifle to be able to do well. And so obviously the higher the optic is, the more my hold is, and it starts to get a little bit vague there and a little bit hard to estimate up close. But the bottom line is the estimation is essentially the same up close on any practically sized target. And so it's not something that personally I'm really concerned about. So the holdovers don't bother me. The other con people like to talk about is basically ballistic performance downrange. So, you can imagine, obviously, if my optic is sitting above my bore, and let's say they're really close together, I've got a low mount. Well, then if I have my optic zeroed at 50 meters or whatever the distance is, this is kind of a fairly obtuse angle where the bullet has to rise slowly over time and meet my point of aim, right? Whereas if I have a tall mount, where the mount is sitting significantly above the rifle, my round now has to climb significantly more steeply to meet my point of aim, and therefore my holdover is likely to be significantly greater at max ord, right? If that's something that's concerning to you, a couple things to think about. Number one, this really shows up on up close zero. So like if you're a big proponent of like the 36-yard zero, this is gonna affect you a lot more than if you have your rifle zeroed farther out. So if you're really stuck on like a 36-yard zero, something to think about, right? The taller your mount is, the higher you're above your point of aim, your max ord is gonna be, and it's gonna be a little more complex for you with your holds. What I find is if I have my rifle zeroed out at farther distances, like especially if it's a max ord zero, like I have it zeroed out at 100 yards, then it's really not an issue at all, right? What I've essentially done now is I've zeroed my gun at what max ord means is just the peak of that flight path, right? So I'm never really gonna have any hold unders at all. The round is just simply gonna climb to meet my point of aim, and then it's gonna start falling back off, right? And the fact that my mount is taller is not really gonna impact me too much. I'm not gonna try to throw out specific numbers about this, because what you really have to do is think about your rifle, your barrel length, your ammo, what optic you're running, and put all that together and figure out for you, what's my data set? How much is this going to impact me on my rifle if you want specifics? So I'm not going to try to give you specifics on that, but that is something to consider depending on what zero you like to use and how much that means to you. Other big con, this is nothing I can say about this, right? These things are really expensive, right? So you're looking at least a couple $100 per mount if you're running both an optic and a magnifier. You're looking at $400 or $500 just in optic mounts on your rifle. That's a lot, right? So let me say this, you don't need this. You don't need it, right? If you shoot a lot, if these are specific features you're looking for, and if you have the budget, they're nice to have. I enjoy them for the reasons we discussed in this video, but if this is not in your budget, you do not need this. I promise you this mount is not what's holding you back from your performance goals, right? So guys, hopefully that answers some of your questions on the fast mount. Not a ton to say about them, but I get those questions very, very regularly. So I wanted to throw out a video explaining things I like about the fast mount, why I use them, some of the pros and cons. If I missed anything, please drop a comment down below and I will try to answer those questions for you. Thanks so much.